I'm surprised today to read headlines suggesting Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull had recovered in the latest news poll, was back in the contest at last. The coalition edges higher in key polls, said In Daily. The coalition regains ground with voters, said news.com.au. And Channel 7's news site treated Labor leader Bill Shorten as now the leader in strife, with the headline, Labor defends Shorten's poor ratings. I mean, I had to go back into the newspapers and double check. I mean, can we just back up here? Here are the news poll results for Labor and the coalition government over the past year. As you can see, today's results just returns the government to about the same terrible levels of the past 3 months. 47 to 53 behind. For all the spin, the fact remains there is zero sign of the Turnbull government recovering, and it's time, I believe, that Liberal MPs faced the facts about that. Joining me is Peter Credlin, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Peter, it's great to see you. Hey, listen, why is this news poll being spun into good news for the government?
Well, I don't think it's good news for the government. It's good news for Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, he'll hold his seat by the look of that at the next election if you look at his personal popularity. But the only count that matters, Andrew, is primary vote and 2PP, two-party preferred. And he might hold his seat, but the government will lose government on those numbers. And it's been consistently around that territory, 47-53, as you've said, for 3 months. In fact, last news poll that went down to 46-54 was the worst news poll, but only one other. So in 12 months, that was probably one of the worst results. It was one of the worst results. So it's a recovery in part, but it's a recovery back from annihilation to landslide loss. You know, it's not a turnaround. The only bright light...
within the margin of error anyway, Peter. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
The only bright light is that Shorten has continued personal unpopularity, and he's not seen as a Prime Minister. He has made some recovery in some of these polls. He and the Prime Minister are about the same in terms of their net satisfaction levels, and in fact it's net dissatisfaction for both of them. But Shorten hasn't been able to translate into the top job. Now, that's not necessarily unusual. Tony Abbott was never really in preferred Prime Minister territory and then won in a landslide. So Liberals, coalition MPs in particular, take comfort from Shorten being seemingly unpopular as Prime Minister, shouldn't sit back and take their foot off the pedal and think they'll slide over the line, because they won't. They won't. But it shows that Shorten has a bit to do on his personality and his preference.
No, but it also shows that perhaps he could be vulnerable, but so far not under Malcolm Turnbull, with him leading the government.
So there's opportunity, you're right, Andrew, there's opportunity there, but that government can't seize on it yet. No,
that's correct. Meanwhile, the government Parliament's back, and the government's also back in that same mess from the last time they all sat. Citizenship. The Prime Minister leaves for overseas this week. And Barnaby Joyce becomes acting Prime Minister, even though the High Court is still to decide whether he was unlawfully elected as a New Zealander, as a New Zealand citizen. Now, Labor is asking, Peter, why we can have an acting Prime Minister who may not even be a proper MP. Is it right to ask?
Look, I think it is right to ask, and if we were in opposition, Andrew, I think we'd ask the same questions under my time as Chief of Staff. I mean, you have the real issue at the moment. I know we move on to other things. We're talking about same-sex marriage and many, many other things at the moment, but Australia is under its highest ever terrorism threat level. And I know from my time with the Prime Minister, there are a number of triggers that sit with the Prime Minister should something horrible happen in this country, should there be a risk. And there's call-out powers and many other things. Now, I know they vest. Yes, they do. They vest in the acting Prime Minister if the Prime Minister is offshore. But if there are real and genuine concerns about the legitimacy of the Deputy Prime Minister, who then becomes obviously the acting Prime Minister, then I wouldn't put these things to the test. I wouldn't put myself or my government through any risk of contested decision-making and contested decision-making at a time, as I said, of terror threat and other concerns. Pacific Island Forum is important, but it is not a forum that happens that the Prime Minister must attend, like perhaps say the G20 and others. I think this is one that I would send the Foreign Minister or send another minister. I would not send the Prime Minister. I think it just gives them a distraction they do not need right in the middle of a double-sitting fortnight when the government has got to start turning things around.
Well, you mentioned the contested decision-making, and that goes to a broader issue. It's not just whether the contested decisions of a Prime Minister who may not, acting Prime Minister who may not actually be a legitimate MP. It goes to his role in Cabinet, along with his Deputy Fiona Nash, also in Cabinet. Yes. She's got a citizenship question to answer too, as English. If it turns out, and we get constitutional law experts saying, like George Williams, if it turns out that they're not lawfully elected as dual citizens, if the High Court rules that, then every decision that Cabinet has made with them part of it could be legally challenged. Now, Peter, worried me?
Right. Now, whether or not those challenges will get up, let's see. But you're right, Andrew. Every decision could be challenged.
But here's what disturbs me a bit about that, Peter. Obviously that's your view, that's George Williams' view. We'll yet to see. But rather than deny the Cabinet's decisions could be challenged, when the Prime Minister was asked about that today, about exactly this issue by Tanya Plibersek, he simply dismissed the questions hypothetical. Have a listen.
Since the government became aware that there was doubt over the qualifications of the Deputy Prime Minister to be a Member of Parliament, how many executive orders, grants, delegations, appointments and legislative instruments has the Deputy Prime Minister signed or made?
The government is absolutely satisfied that the Deputy Prime Minister is qualified to sit in the House.
Peter, from that answer, am I wrong to suspect that the Prime Minister does know there's a problem here and didn't want to give an answer?
Well, the Prime Minister's not on the High Court bench, right? I know he likes to cover the field, and I think there's been a bit of bluster, as some have argued, bullying of the High Court with comments he made in the last sitting week that the High Court will find. Well, the High Court won't find what the Prime Minister tells them to find. They're an eminent bench of jurists, and they will find, based on precedent in their own legal judgments, the decision that will come out in the middle of October. I wouldn't be so sure, if I was the Prime Minister, that the bullying of the High Court is the right tactic. Indeed, I have been told by others that the Solicitor General's advice was a line ball call. Now, I know the Labor Party have tried to pursue the release of that advice. If I was the Labor Party, I'd be asking to see a copy of that advice. They're entitled to. Government doesn't have to give it to them, of course. It doesn't have to be made public. But the Prime Minister is, I think, certainly standing at the dispatch box, Andrew, and making out that this is a fait accompli, that it's, a lay-down misère that the High Court will find in favour of Barnaby Joyce. I think, and you look at people far more eminent than me, like George Williams and others, who think this is a 50-50 call. And if I was the Prime Minister, I wouldn't risk a 50-50 call by being absent and putting one of the contested players in the seat as acting Prime Minister. I mean, he's talked today, a big press conference, about the issues in relation to North Korea. As I said, we're on heightened security watch in this country. I think Australians would have a lot more comfort if the Prime Minister didn't go to Samoa and stayed in Australia on the weekend.
There's no votes to win in Samoa, I would have thought. But you know what really does annoy me here, though, Peter, is that some MPs have dobbed themselves into the High Court, and they, like Matt Canavan of the Nationals,
yes,
as possible dual nationals that may not be able to sit. But then on the other side, you've got Labor MPs refusing not only to dob themselves in for adjudication by the High Court, but refusing to release documents to prove that they're not dual nationals. I just think this is so loaded. Now, one of them has been Labor leader Bill Shorten himself, as you know, who could be British through his father. Tony Abbott today called him out. Tony Abbott was born in London, but has shown the documents that prove that he renounces British citizenship. Today, he dared Shorten to do the same. Here he is.
I say to Bill Shorten, show it or shut up. Show your letter or shut up about Barnaby Joyce, because if you haven't got a letter, you're in exactly the same position that he is in, and you should let him and you should let the Parliament get on with its job this week.
Well, Peter, that dare seemed to have finally shaken Shorten. Has been refusing for weeks to do this, but today, voila, here he is.
I will not allow the Prime Minister to use a smear about me as cover for the crisis which engulfs his government. So in order to put this matter to rest once and for all—
Members on my right.
I seek leave to table a copy of correspondence from the UK Home Office confirming that I successfully renounced my UK citizenship prior to my election to Parliament in 2007.
Peter, what's the ramifications of all that? I guess that's a victory for Tony Abbott. How does that advance the politics of the issue?
I'll give you an insider's analysis, actually, of that over the last sort of 24 hours. There was a great frustration with a lot of the backbench and ministers I spoke to that the government had stopped pursuing Shorten, and no one can understand why it was suddenly dropped. The advice that I was getting was that the Prime Minister's office was saying, don't talk about citizenship, it's not very good for us, don't talk about it. But they were letting Shorten get off the hook. Now, Barnaby was starting to fry on this issue and was worried about coming into a sitting week, and calls went out to a range of people who would not front on this issue. Tony Abbott said he would go out there and he would, you know, by his own example, prove that you put up or shut up in terms of that paperwork. And that forced Shorten out. It tells you two things. One, Labor are nimble. They've decided at that point today that if Abbott was after them, it would be an ensuing distraction on their side, and they want the distraction with the government. So Shorten promptly went into the chamber and tabled his documents. Two, it shows that if the government wants to get into the game again, and let's go back to those polls, they have not had a winning poll since the election, and they lost 14 seats at the election, and they won by-election from annihilation. They are crazy to have one of their best performers and certainly one of their toughest parliamentarians languishing on the backbench because one action by Abbott today flushed out Shorten within a matter of hours in a way that most of that front bench had been flailing around for a fortnight.
Yeah, but look, I couldn't agree with you more. And it now enables the government to put the heat on other Labor MPs
Correct.
To front up with their documents. Finally, some traction. Just quickly before we go, Sharri Markson in the telly had a great scoop today saying that Tony Abbott as Prime Minister was once flying back in his VIP jet from a Sydney function with Malcolm Turnbull and other ministers. Turnbull had had a bit to drink, apparently, and started abusing Abbott, calling him hopeless and a disloyal C word. Sharri said she had three sources for her story, but Malcolm Turnbull today said, and this may make you laugh, he never uses the C word. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop says she was there and it didn't happen. Is anyone lying here, by the way?
I'll treat it seriously because I think it's serious when that sort of language is thrown around, Andrew. I work for Malcolm Turnbull. If he says he doesn't use that language, then I have to say it is wrong because he does. He certainly used it in the time I worked for him. In relation to that incident, when it occurred in the middle of 2014, I was asked by the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott to make sure that story never saw the light of day and to speak to our staff, the Prime Minister's staff, who were privy. To their great credit, Andrew, 3.5 odd years, that story has been kept quiet. I don't know why someone has chosen to put it out in the public domain. I know the Prime Minister then, Mr Abbott, spoke to the RAF staff because unfortunately it was said in front of uniformed stewards. And I know Mr Abbott also spoke to the AFP who were privy to the conversation. So I think it's unfortunate. I don't think this sort of commentary on the front page of a major newspaper does politics any good. It certainly doesn't do any good to any of the individuals. But anyone who thinks that Malcolm Turnbull woke up one night close to September 2015 and decided he wanted Tony Abbott's job, let me tell you, it started a long, long time earlier than that.
Yeah, I've got to, for context, say that that occurred only 10 months into Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership. And it also shows that Tony Abbott did not leak against Malcolm Turnbull the way the vice versa went.
Look, there's that story and many more. I could sit on your show most nights and give you an exclusive. That's not the way.
All right, next week.
That's not. No, that's not the way I want to play it. But I'm also not going to lie. I'm also not going to lie.
No,
so I'll
good
send
on
that
you.
message to the PMO. I'm not going to lie.
Peter Credlin, you never do, and I thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Coming up.